Okay, well, we talked about hybrid conflict in Ukraine. I'm going to turn this over now to you to talk about what might be next. Thank you, Matt.
So just a quick tee up for this session. It's called Blinking Red. What are the signals and indicators telling us about where the next hybrid conflict will happen? So we have General Keith Alexander, Chris Krebs, Stu Solomon, and I'm going to turn it over now to our esteemed moderator, Frank Cilluffo. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Hey, Frank, I'm sorry. I think you're on mute, my friend. Would you mind starting over for us? Thank you.
Okay, sorry, that was all congratulations to y'all. So no, it's a privilege to be here, and congrats, Matt, to you and Suzanne for putting together another amazing day here. I have the privilege of moderating a discussion with three truly esteemed professionals in the field, three people I look up to and respect. And we get to talk about some of the lessons learned, or at least the initial lessons learned, and what the implications are more broadly for hybrid warfare. Let me start with, there is no universally agreed to definition for hybrid conflict or hybrid warfare. For general terms, my terminology, you guys can all shoot me down if you disagree, but I look at it as any adversary that employs a tailored mix of conventional and irregular means to achieve its objectives. It can incorporate both kinetic and or non-kinetic instruments of power. And we have three people who bring a whole lot to the table on this. Firstly, General Keith Alexander, who, as I think everyone knows, was not only director of the National Security Agency, but also commander of U.S. Cyber Command, brings a ton of expertise to this. My longtime friend, Chris Krebs, who was initially with NPPD. I don't even remember what NPPD stands for, Chris, so I'll let you jump there, but also was the original director of what is the new and improved CISA over at the Department of Homeland Security. And last but certainly not least, Stu Solomon, who's president of Recorded Future. And as we heard just before, a nice kudos from an on-the-ground perspective in Ukraine as to how Recorded Future has been helpful in today's horrific environment. Let's start with, since we just talked through, just heard some insights from the inside in terms of what's going on in the scene on the ground in Ukraine. What do we think the initial lessons learned are? What are the implications, not only from the red, those of us who are in the national security space often look at it from the adversarial perspective, but also the positive implications from a blue, the defender, not just the aggressor. And then I'm going to segue into, I think, a prelude to the next conversation. What are the implications for Taiwan? But General Alexander, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts in terms of what we're seeing thus far?
I think it's interesting because we're going to talk about what we see. And I think a majority of what's going on is below the visibility for almost everyone. As you know, our nation and Europe started out with a forward defense capability, and the Russians have done over 4,000 attacks on Ukraine. So those two partnerships are playing out tension in cyber. Russia has been good about using cyber as an element of national power and to help them in their physical combat. They often sync those two up, as they did in 2008 in Georgia, what they did in Estonia. So they have a playbook to do that. I think what that means in general is we're seeing that play out. It's not yet really fully baked in terms of how you would actually conduct cyber warfare as part of a physical war. I think the Chinese are learning from that there's a lot that they need to do to get better. And we can talk about that, as you said, later. The Russians are already learning they are woefully inadequate to take on Ukraine and Europe and the US and others. So I think from my perspective, what it says, you know, people could say, well, there wasn't much there. I look at just the opposite. What I'm really worried about is that we believe that we're safe. we're not safe. There is a lot that's going on. The offense has the advantage, and there's a lot our nation needs to do to actually up our defense. So I think, it's good that Chris and Stu are here, because Chris has the lead for helping, or did have the lead for helping to defend the country with the commercial sector. But it's hard to see what's hitting the commercial sector. So my bottom line is there's no collective defense today for our country. What we have is people feeding information, but at the speed that this is going at, collective defense, we need to get really good at this, and we need to do that quickly. Ukraine shows how other countries can attack an infrastructure and have some level of success. Imagine if that were our country. We have a lot more infrastructure that is susceptible to these types of attacks. We saw that with the 2017 attack, the NotPetya attack, and the impact of that. And I think there's a lot that we need to do. And so I'm glad that Chris is here, because half of this is, what do we do to get the commercial side of our country up and running? And how does that commercial side and the government, the military, work together to defend? I know there's a lot of work that has gone into building that, but the 95% is all these companies out there that have some responsibility in helping to bring that together. So I'll pause there, Frank, and hand it over to my friend, my classmate, Chris.
Both incisive and sobering in many ways. I like to say what we see over there could come soon to a theater near you, and we always have a lot to learn. I mean, Chris, Keith did tee up. You had the responsibility to incorporate some of this, and were involved in some of the early efforts and all the preceding sorts of events that force us to not only pontificate about these issues, but act upon on some of them. So what are your thoughts at this point, Chris? And I know you've done a lot of good work on the disinformation side as well, which clearly is part of the equation. And I've been told that talk is cheap, listening could be priceless, so I don't want to talk too much. But one thing that the Colonel mentioned just before he dropped, I think is really important, and that is, it's not about that drive-by cyber capability alone. It's the fact that those that are integrating computer network attack and exploit into their warfighting strategy and doctrine will be leading in the days ahead. So let me turn it over to you, Chris. Hey, Chris, I think you're on mute, my friend. Uh-oh. Does anyone else hear Chris, or is it just me? I am hard of hearing, so my wife says it's selective, but. Hey, Chris, why don't we give you a minute to try to figure this out? And Stu, I mean, one thing that has changed over the years is, I mean, when you start looking at all the concrete cyber intelligence and the products that are out there, I think 10 years ago, those of us talking about these issues the way we are today would have all been wearing orange, and I'm not talking the Auburn orange. And I think a big part of that has a lot to do with the private sector and the role it's played to ultimately enhance all of our capabilities. So what are your thoughts? And I'd be curious to, don't be shy or humble, what role has Recorded Future played in the current crisis?
No, I very much appreciate that, and thanks for the opportunity to kind of talk through this. I did actually want to address the question that you just posed a second ago, and then I'll go into the private sector piece. I think that incorporation of cyber into what I would consider to be a confluence of activity between physical, logical, and then the influence ops that surround them. But incorporating that into doctrine is great. But I think as we well know, as we've grown as a cyber capability inside the United States and frankly across Western powers, it's not just about doctrine and intent, it's also about target deconfliction, around command and control, around good communications. By the way, all the things that the Russians are having difficulty with on the battlefield in a kinetic fashion. of course they're going to have similar kind of issues applying that particular element of power as well. So this shouldn't come as a big surprise when they're not able to do the core fundamentals of applying power against a target, that cyber is not going to be any different. So I would just offer that up as just some context to what you mentioned a moment ago. With respect to the role that the private sector plays in this, I think this has been, in my mind, one of the proudest moments as somebody who's both worn uniform and been in the vendor community for some time, that we're able to look at how to actually apply goodwill and desire to support into something tangible and beneficial. You know, I liken it to the analogy of kids running to a soccer ball, you know, and all gathering around that ball and trying to figure it all out. It just becomes a gaggle and a mess. Well, it's the same thing here. We all wanted to help, but being thoughtful in the way that we helped was really critical. And doing so in a coordinated fashion mattered as a community. And I think we realized this early on, and I've mentioned this in previous conversations as well, but there was a fundamental moment at the very beginning of the conflict where the community came together and said, what can we give Ukraine to help in their war effort? And what we realized fundamentally is what we needed to do was not give them more stuff, but make them better consumers and users of the intelligence, of the telemetry data, of the defensive and detective controls that we were giving them in the first place, to turn them into better consumers and more efficient users of that knowledge. And I think that bias towards action rather than just towards flooding them with content was really a critical moment in kind of helping to turn the tides. I think I'll stop there with that comment, but I think that's fundamentally important. It's not just about giving, it's about turning them into better users and consumers. And that's where private industry can really help.
And Stu, I do want to pull that thread later because it has implications far beyond the current battlefield and crisis. And more importantly, I know General Alexander has heard more than once, intelligence is great, but if it's not operational or useful, it's nothing more than a good idea. So I do want to pull that thread in a little bit. But Chris, let's see if we can hear you now.
Yep. How's that?
All good.
Good. All right. So a few kind of thoughts on what's happened in the last year or so, and then how that applies forward. So General Alexander talked about those 4,000 attacks. So there's clear that there was a significant volume of Russian cyber activity directed against Ukraine and possibly other targets. Now, as you look back kind of in the totality of those attacks, what's the strategic relevance? What's been the strategic impact? It's hard to say that there's really been a determining cyber attack. Viasat's the most visible. There was attacks against the telecommunications carriers in Ukraine. So I think at least for this event, it's clear that the Russians rolled a more of a contributing factor attack set against the Ukrainians. And Andy Boyd talked about this a few weeks ago on the Risky Business podcast. So it's really hard actually to do integrated arms using C&E. And the challenge here is speed, intensity, and control. So you can do a lot of other stuff in the kinetic space and control those three factors. But once you start bringing in these more novel or more modern or recent capabilities, it's hard to loop them all together. I think that's one of the challenges that the Russians experienced, and whether that's because the GRU and the FSB and the SDR didn't have the appropriate heads up from the Kremlin to start coordinating these actions. I don't know. We'll see. But again, it's hard to do these integrated ops at this time. Now, I think the Chinese probably have a much different discipline in doctrine is they're eyeing Taiwan. I think another aspect here from blue team perspective is what happened in the wake of the 2014 invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. And what we've seen is a focused and determined effort to improve defenses in Ukraine. And part of this is just they got the reps, because between 2015 2016, the GRU Sandworm going after the grid and some of those other attacks, not Petya, they had plenty of reps on keyboards to help develop that strength as well as start defending their networks. But more importantly, they really showed, I think more than anything, resilience. So they could take a hit, they could lose a couple capabilities, but keep their core processes moving forward. and they had a plan on how to restore and recover. And so that tells me that time is a defender's advantage. And so right now, that's what the Taiwanese should be looking at, is if they have time, and if you listen to the deputy director of the CIA, and it's, let's say it's 2027, which is kind of that threshold for an invasion, perhaps by the Chinese, that gives you time as defenders to help prepare, harden those networks, develop resilience. And one of the key things is some of the teams that Keith stood up several years ago that General Nakasone has really used, I think, quite effectively, is those defend forward capabilities, getting in there, understanding what the adversary is doing, helping support those networks, but also bringing some of that know-how and experience going toe-to-toe with the adversary back home. And so the last thing I'd say is, as we look at what happened January of 21, if not December of 2020, was that ramp up of, 21 to 22, ramp up of the Shields Up campaign. I think we nailed it in terms of the messaging and the engagement, having the president come and talk about this, going to the business roundtable and talk about cyber defenses here domestically. I think one of the things perhaps we didn't get right, and there's no one's fault here, is the timing of it all. I do think that we are far from out of the woods here. I think as the Russians continue to experience some challenges, and as more lethal aid and sanctions, more lethal aid flows to Ukraine, and as sanctions continue to have a significant effect on the Russian economy, they're going to start using unconventional capabilities like cyber. And so I think we have to keep that shields up mentality in place, but I think it's also going to be helpful going forward, again, as we start thinking about what some of the other geopolitical flashpoints could be around the globe.
Well, thank you, Chris. And you've all alluded to it, and I started with the discussion. Let's jump into implications for Taiwan, and maybe starting with, I mean, we tend to, in the community, sometimes mirror image and think that folks are gleaning the same lessons we all are. I think the one that matters the most is what President Xi is his interpretation of what these activities could entail for Taiwan. But Keith, why don't we start with you, then go to Chris, and then go to Stu, because I think that you all touched on key points. Time can sometimes be in Blue's favor. I still think the initiative remains with the attacker, but I think we can level that playing field a little more. So, General, you want to kick us off and jump into this is a big wasp's nest, so we know there are a whole lot of ideas here, but I don't think it's academic.
I'll stir up the wasp's nest and step out and let Chris get in. I think the key thing that Chris brought out is training. If you're going to conduct warfare, whether it is combined arms or it includes cyber and other elements of national power, you have to train to do it. The Russians failed on that, and across their logistics, their fire, all of these aspects, and cyber, to bring all that together. So the first thing that Xi Jinping is looking at is, okay, they failed on that. The second is, who's your target? In Ukraine, the target for Russia was Ukraine. It wasn't the United States, it was Ukraine. In Taiwan, the target's not Taiwan only, it's the United States. And their intent is to keep us out of the war. Sounds very familiar to World War II. And the way they do that is to try to knock us out by hitting our infrastructure with cyber. As part of their doctrine, they've stated that publicly, to take on a technologically superior country, read the United States, they would use cyber first. They would go after not only the defense industrial base, our logistics system, but also critical infrastructure, energy and other things. And that's something that they will constantly work to get better at. They will train. They've seen how Russia has failed in each of these steps. And there's been writings on this in Chinese newspapers about all the problems that they've had. So when I look at it, what this says to me is, first, Xi Jinping understands it. He has two goals. One was to rebuild his military, and the other, take Taiwan. He's going to do both of those. And so we shouldn't be fooled any place else. This is going to come at us. So we have some time to train. We have to train the defense, because what we cannot afford to do is to lose in the first 10 days of a cyber attack and have ours say, oh, sorry, take Taiwan, we're done. You know, we go in and they do that. It would be even better if they came at us and we knocked it down and said, don't try that, you know, after Taiwan. We could stop the attack by winning the cyber phase. In my experience in warfare, is you have elements of the thing. I get to objective A, then I go to B, then I go to C. If A doesn't materialize, you got to then relook, are you going to take on B and C? And in this case, that cyber element for China will be a factor in deciding what they do in the next step. I believe that is absolutely critical for us. As a nation, we're not ready. And so that's what we have to do. That's the work. And a lot of people say, well, you don't understand. I spend all this money on it. It's not the money. It's the training. It's the visibility. It's the sharing between the government and the private sector that we have to do. So I'll pass it over to Chris, who was responsible for doing all that on the private.
Before Chris jumps in, any insights you want to share? Because Chris knows I'm the hugest proponent of defend forward, you'll find, but so I'm not going to opine too much there. But anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think that's going to be part of it. It's absolutely part of it. You've got to defend forward to stop that. The issue is there are more Chinese offensive teams by almost an order of magnitude than Russia has. So we can defend forward in Russia. You can't defend forward in China as easily. So you can defend forward and block some, but that's like, you know, half the artillery rounds hit. That's not a good thing.
Yep.
And so this is the problem that we have. In order to focus our offense, our defense has to let them know what's being attacked. Chris's job in this whole thing, his former job, was to say, what's a priority for the offense to protect, to ensure continuity of government. So you have all of this that's going on, and we haven't trained in that. That is a very serious undertaking because our nation has never been attacked like that. Continuity of government, can you imagine that if you shut down communications and the internet in the US, what happens?
Yeah.
It's mass hysteria. We're not ready for this kind of thing. So we have to get ready.
Chris?
Yeah, I want to kind of pick up on that last piece of continuity of government. And it's obviously much broader than just continuity of government. It's ensuring that, yes, public institutions continue to function. They can take a lick and keep on ticking. But we have to be thinking about those things, Frank, that you were focused on during the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and that's the continuity of the economy. So Jen Easterly, Director Easterly of CISA, talked about this the other day in a House budget or appropriations hearing, thinking about the threat that China poses. It's not just to Taiwan. It is, as the general said, it is interrupting our ability to project force. And that's not just from a technical logistics perspective, but it's also a psychosocial impact. So what are the things that I would expect are the same things that the administration was worried about at the onset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's looking at things like, going after the water system in key large urban areas. You knock out the water in the city of Atlanta for 5 days, you've got a major problem. Look at what happened with Colonial Pipeline. We were really teetering on the edge of social unrest. And so I think from a defensive perspective, yes, we've got to harden networks, but the key here is going to have to be resilient, that we know what is most important, we defend it, but we ensure that if we take a hit, that we can fail over, and it's not catastrophic after the first failover, that we have that ability to pull in additional resources. And, we do this during hurricane season, so there is a training function, at least for the grid. But what happens when it becomes a broader scale, more regional type event? Again, Colonial was a pretty nice trial run and wake-up call for us there. But, going back to that piece of talking about Taiwan is just like Ukraine. They have time, they have opportunity to improve their defenses. This is where I would expect, I assume any geopolitical flashpoint going forward is going to have defend forward teams in there, understanding not just what the adversary is doing, but also hardening those networks and ensuring that they're more resilient.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Very, very thoughtful. Stu, I mean, General Alexander sort of, from an indication and warning perspective, the first indicator may be on our end at CONUS. So I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are on all this. And And I want to pull on a theme that Chris touched on with continuity of the economy, but in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
How many companies are ready, say Taiwan does fall? Not only the national security implications, but what are the economic implications? Are the big banks making sure that they prioritize semiconductors in the event of a really awful day? I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are there. So, and I don't expect you to talk for the entire economy, but you're the private sector guy, so.
Yeah, I would actually offer that when you start to think about the kind of protecting or hardening the economy, I think we're instantly going towards a sense of resiliency. We're instantly going towards more effective defensive and detective controls. I would argue, as the kind of instability in the mid-tier banking system has shown us over the last couple of weeks, really what this is a softer target that could be influenced more by influence ops than almost anything else. So you don't necessarily have to break a bank to be able to break public confidence in the banking system and create an outsized effect there. So I would offer that we should also be thinking of this in terms of what are softer, less protected ways to create an outsized impact. And that's where I think the hybrid nature of cyber conflict comes in. The influence op is something that we should be equally concerned about. And what I would argue is we got a little bit of a blueprint of how to deal with that during the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, in that what breaks down bad information is good information. And so to create an amplifying effect for the truth is an interesting counter weapon to the effects that we could see there. And I think that's what the economy is probably even more susceptible to, is right now maligned or maligned influence or influence operations to be able to shake public confidence. The other things are things that there are regulations for. There are tried and true practices and processes. Now, we could argue all day about the maturity of those control environments and how ubiquitously they're applied. But what we can say for certain is hardening is only once the attack has been effective. There are easier ways to create the impact. So I would argue that's where we put some focus.
Awesome. The tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant. I want to do a lightning round. We talked China, but who else is gleaning insights here? And here's the reality. From my perspective, hybrid warfare has been with us for years. It's not, we may have coined it, codified it, doctrinally trying to get our arms around it, but if you look at it through the eyes of the enemy, not the good guys, they've been engaging in elements of hybrid warfare since gosh knows when. So I'd be curious, who else is picking up lessons, and what should we be thinking about? Proxies, not just state actors, but non-state actors. And this is literally a 30-second from each of you. So Stuart, why don't we start with you, go to Chris, and then end with General Alexander.
Yeah, there's a confluence of activities in the Middle East right now that make me super uncomfortable. That Iran can take advantage of political instability in Israel and availability of lots of weapons and stuff.
Roger that. And Iran has been engaged in irregular warfare forever. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, look at 2020 election, the Iranians engaged in intimidation techniques and attacks. Here's the reality, is that every single country on the face of the earth is building some kind of CNE or CNO capability, and that's only going to be the way of the world going forward. And if they're not doing it, they're not even trying. The barriers to entry are so low here. Now, the real difference maker is who's effective, and as Keith talked about, it requires commitment, discipline, training, and execution. 10-4,
well said. General, you got the last word.
All right, so I think it's the confluence. I agree with Stuart on Iran, but I would add to it, Iran has a partnership now with Russia and with China. And I think an emboldened Iran will take action, as he said, not only against Gulf states. Interesting that they have this treaty with Saudi Arabia. I don't believe it, but for sure they will attack Israel. And they've attacked Europe and the United States as they did in 2012. We're going to see a lot of this go on. I'm worried that we're seeing a bipolar world with Iran, Russia, and China over here, trying to bring in a bunch of countries to either be neutral or on their side, while Europe, the United States, and some Southeast Asian countries are working together. I think that's what we're going to see, and I think we're going to see those two start to act against each other and the not aligned are going to stand on the sidelines.
That's a sobering ending, and the image that I got is that bar scene in the original Star Wars where you have all sorts of different actors, and the reality is we do need to get our arms around this. I'm going to turn it back over to Suzanne and Matt, but let me, before doing that, thank you all for your time. It was phenomenal as expected, and over to you, Suzanne. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. I think there are so many, again, I'm just like furiously taking notes over here, but I think the thing that Keith ended, General Alexander ended that conversation on this bipolar world is kind of a theme that's going to be driving a lot of our future conversations. Frank masterfully moderated that panel. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.